Swagata does. Swagata actually recently completed her PhD in KU Leuven in Belgium. I know Swagata because her work is actually on Brahmaputra, and I had a lot of conversation with her during her PhD as well when she was doing her work. She is from Assam, but now she's settled in Belgium, but she was traveling to Assam, and so I told her that there are a lot of people who work on this area. Why don't you come and make a presentation? So thank you, Swagata, for coming. Other things you already know about her because an abstract and bio was sent, so I'm not going to repeat, but yes, she has of course published her work in various international journals and books, and she has also worked closely with government of India, like in Niti Aayog. What is interesting for her work, and I think would be interesting for us coming from HSS, is that she is actually trained as an architect. So what I liked about her thesis when I looked at it is very nicely and beautifully using architect design, she presents her work, and I think today also you will be presenting. So yeah, as you see, from fieldwork to drawing, so a lot of drawings, and through those drawings she tries to actually explain her research findings. So over to you, Swagata.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much for the kind introduction and the invitation to share my work. So my talk today is titled From Fieldworks to Drawings. So I'll be talking about the process of mapping the Brahmaputra floodplains. So actually it's based on, as Professor Borwa mentioned, it's based on my PhD dissertation in Leuven. So I'm trained as an architect and I did my master's in urbanism. So it's a lot about visual mediums for translating the work, which I think you will appreciate. So this is actually my dissertation, and it's also available online. It's open access. I have made it open access. So in case you want to refer to the drawings, or because I'll read a part of the thesis. So if you want to look at other cases, please feel free to do it. And as you can see, Professor Borwa was also the local promoter for my dissertation, and that's how we came into contact, and she put me in contact with other people who were working on the Brahmaputra. So as I said, so my research is based on this very specific riverine environment of the Brahmaputra, which is at the front line of global warming and urbanization. And within the basin, I focus on a very specific part, the part of the river in Assam, which you see in dotted lines. And what really interested me, apart from me being from Assam, because it is within this part, the river develops like this oscillating braided nature, creating like these webs of channels. So that was like the starting point of what got me really excited about doing the research in this part. So as I was starting the research, I was looking at it through the lens of urbanism, so which is basically we look at how people interact with the built environment. What came out was two very distinct ways of inhabiting this landscape. So the one on the right, you could see boatmen who are utilizing the river's current to transport bamboo on the Brahmaputra, so really working with the flux of the river. And on the other hand, you could see the ongoing construction of several bridges. This is one of them. This one is in lower Assam, which promises this kind of all-weather connectivity between the north and south bank. So it's these two images really, they highlight the tension between, on one side, the traditional livelihoods on the Brahmaputra, but that accommodates the flux, and also on the other hand, the contemporary projects that are coming up, which that risk erasing these kind of adaptive ways of living with the river. So what is actually happening in the Brahmaputra is not a very unique phenomena. It's part of what's happening all around the world. Here you can see the Mississippi River in the picture, the straightening of the Mississippi River, and it's part of this process of taming rivers all over the world. And on this map, it's a map by Harold Frisk. So what he does is he traces the meanders of the river in different various years. So if you see here, so this is the river at one particular year in question, and all of the other colors are various different years. So what he in fact shows fantastically is he shows how much the river moves in different years. So imagine you put this mighty river in enclosures, which is what we are doing, and then it's very natural for the river to break these enclosures, and then we call it natural disasters, and when in fact it's very much man-made because it's born out of man's desire to conquer and tame nature. Similarly, in the Brahmaputra floodplains, they are very much lived spaces. They are spaces that are woven into agrarian rhythms, spiritual geographies, and histories of communities. So what is happening, in fact, now in the last 10-15 years, much more we can observe, is that state-led, let's say, land use planning and master plans, they are trying to translate these very complex relationship that we have with the river into these static categories of developable lands. And there is a certain logic to it, because when you make it developable land, it aligns with, let's say, investment priorities or infrastructural blueprints. So today, a new relationship between the river and the floodplains and the community has been forged. And increasingly, land is being used to accommodate the growing urbanization of Assam. And in that regard, what happens is land becomes very precious, which has to be saved from water. And thus, that's why the title of the thesis was Relearning Our Relationships with Water, because somehow along the way we have forgotten how to relate with water, and we have a very different kind of relationship with water. So in that case, I looked specifically into the chores of Assam. So we call them in Assamese Sor Sapori. So they are basically the river banks and the river islands, but we use it interchangeably, because even in the landform, very often there is a river island that would become part of the river bank, and in flooding it would break off and become a river island. But what drew me to these very shifting landscape is they are a very uniquely fluid environment where the demarcation between land and water, they cannot be well defined, or they cannot be made permanent, because every season or every year these land and water, they change. So it really helps accentuate my point when I'm talking that in a landscape like the Brahmaputra, the idea of a land and water, the divide between land and water, it actually doesn't exist on the ground, and even people don't use it in that way. It's just in the maps that we draw it as a blue, the water, and then the land, you draw a line. But in reality, because if you see these images, so this is from Majuli and this is from Lower Assam, New Dhubri, in both of these cases, and this is just a snapshot in one particular, when I was taking the picture. If you go the next day or in the monsoon, it changes constantly, and you can't, if I ask you to draw a line here about what is land and what is water, it doesn't exist. So in that way, I found that the chores are, for me, like these fantastic case studies to highlight my point, that there is this very undeniable power of the dynamic way that nature moves, and it's almost futile to try and control it by building these embankments or enclosures. So even in this drawing, you could see like, so this really comes from drawing in my discipline of urbanism. So when I was drawing this landscape, so this is actually, I just drew the water. So the dark blue is the water in the dry season, and the lighter blue is the water in wet season. But this also is also in a particular year, 2022. And this is actually, there is the border. It's very difficult to pinpoint which area. The Dhubri town is here on the land. And then this is the chore I was studying, Birsing Sor, and then there is the India-Bangladesh border. So even in the border, you can see that it's literally in the water. So to mark, saying that this is India's land and this is Bangladesh land, that's why there is a whole socio-political and background to this site. But from this drawing, what I was trying to bring out is it's really futile to, and that's why we have so many, there is no way that you can say that this is land, because it's constantly changing, and the border is just a line that doesn't exist in reality on the ground. And as I was saying, when I was saying that in this context, the divide between land and water doesn't make much sense. There are scholars who are working on these kind of landscapes. So there is this scholar called Dilip Dakana who talks about when we are studying these kind of landscapes, especially the river and landscape, rather than talking about a land and water, what makes much more sense is talk about gradients of wetness. So what in this drawing I have been trying to do, if you see on one side I have wetter and on this side it goes drier. So let's say we start with water in the middle of the river, and then people use it for different ways. Let's say for transporting goods and people, they would set up boat fishing nets. But as you come more towards the drier, there are different degrees of how wet the ground is. So in certain areas, when you go to the drier, it becomes stable. People would construct houses. But there is so much happening in between where people would use different wetness of the ground to grow, let's say grow certain kind of saplings, or they would have these little puddles of water which are left behind. After the monsoon, people would use smaller nets to fish. And there are these different kind of activities that happens, and also changes within the season, that really makes you show that there in fact is no dry and wet land. It's really these different gradients of wetness which people use in different ways. So within this, my research was actually questioning how understanding the landscape of Sor Sapori, how it can really bring out, dismantle this idea we have of which this very artificial construct of land and water, but rather can we go towards looking at it as the gradients of the landscape, the gradients of wetness. So within that, I was firstly questioning, I was looking a lot into how the social practices of people, they engage with these fluid landscape. Secondly, which I'm focusing more on this presentation, is what are the different kinds of techniques or tools of representation or visualization that we can really use to bring out these gradients. And thirdly, at the end, I was looking at, is there any lessons we can draw from studying these landscapes? So here it was always, I was very clear that I was never going to suggest solutions for the chores, because a lot of the time that was the question I was getting throughout, that are you going to do something for the people, for these landscapes, or how these landscapes are going to be developed. But the idea was always to rather looking at these landscapes as something, in some cases it was like there are these very primitive landscapes that, you know, they live a certain way that we cannot adopt, but it was always that by looking at these landscapes, is there some lessons that we can derive for the rest of the world? So even when we are doing development in Guwahati or other cities, is there certain strategies that we can derive? So it was never an idea of taking it out and copy pasting in other ways, but is there any way of how, let's say, they relate to nature? How is the way they build their construction? So are those things, can we take them conceptually and then look at it in terms of climate adaptation? So in that case, I was focusing on two cases. One was upstream and downstream, and within them I had several shores that I was looking at. The idea of choosing two very distinct geographies was, of course, because they are very distinct geographies. But the shores in both the cases were also inhabited by two very distinct populations. And that gave me an idea of how different kind of communities would navigate similar kind of seasonal landscape. But also I think there was also a very specific role of religion. For instance, it really helped to see how in certain religion, for instance in the missing community, they practice a form of animistic beliefs, how in their animistic beliefs, what is the role of nature and what is the role of man within nature. And then in the downstream case also, of course it was a very different kind of culture, but it was also very important to understand from religious point of view how are they behaving towards certain natural phenomena. It was really governed by the way they looked at the culture and the religion. And of course in both the population there was also very different vulnerabilities, because missing as a riverine community, they had a very let's say historic knowledge of dealing with water, which in the down case it was more like people who had migrated from Bangladesh. So they had a very different way of dealing with the river when they suddenly had to deal. They didn't have that kind of historic knowledge of dealing with floods and the seasonal landscape. So one of the main ways I collected all the data was fieldwork. So maybe it's also important to understand that most of these chores were in very remote corners of Assam, and there's often a very negative imaginary about these landscapes. But it was very important to gain access to get the information about everyday life. And for the fieldwork, I took my mother, which was also a decision that because I. Hello? Okay, I can shout. So the fieldwork, I took my mother. So it also had a very distinct advantages that we were going in these very remote areas, two women, and usually there was a in the beginning, very distinct.
Swagata, just one second. Your headphone, it's not working.
That's okay.
No,
It's not.
Hello? So I think maybe this is also more in terms with the work you do, because in the fieldwork, one of the main challenges I think for first 1 year I was trying to gain access into these communities, and I was trying different ways to, like, of course in most of the areas were very accessible, but also to gain the trust of people I had to cultivate a lot of relationship. But so first I was actually going, it was a lot of trial and error. So there was this boat clinic who used to go from char to char. So I used to first travel with the boat clinics a little bit to see if I can actually gain access, because that's the only way. But then I realized me coming as part of government officers had a very different dynamics. So they would of course talk to me, but when I asked them questions, it was a very direct answer. I wasn't able to get like into their everyday lives or what they actually think. So there was always this layer of me coming from a very top down. And a lot of people who go to chores, let's say for surveys and all, they have a very fixed agenda. I'm not saying a bad agenda, but it's very fixed. They come with a project. So they want to know how many people are living. There are a questionnaire, but I was not going to it. So I felt like I was not getting as much out of it. So somehow in the second year of the PhD, I tried to contact some other people. My father knew someone. So it was by luck I came across this engineer who was from the Char. So his maternal house was still in Bir Singh Sor. Actually, the upstream was quite easy to access because I had a site in Majuli and another in Kartik Sapori where Mulai Kathoni, the forest is. But the downstream, I faced a lot of difficulty. So I found this guy, and eventually we talked a little bit, and he was an engineer working in Dubai, but he had maternal. So he came once, and I tried to align my fieldwork. So he took me to Bir Singh Sor, and when he took me, it was a completely different experience because he introduced me to the villagers. And he was already an insider who has gone out of the Char to study, and he was, let's say, highly respected. So they opened up to me completely differently. They were inviting me into the house because they didn't have, they kind of already trusted me because I was brought in by this person that they trust who was already from the village. So then I think the kind of fieldwork, the way I was invited into the house, I could see how they were farming the different crops. When I also went back, I was constantly talking to them on WhatsApp, so I could ask what crops you are growing, what are you harvesting. So these kind of questions which I initially tried to do with these questionnaires, and because they didn't know. If I asked them what crops do you grow in monsoon season, I mean, they don't know because they don't keep a track of it. That's not the way they document. So I have to ask a lot of 100 questions, like a lot of small talk, drink a lot of tea, and then you will get few answers. So that was a completely different experience. But I think once I got access into it, things became, over the years also when I talked, I had certain points of contact. They also understood what kind of information I was looking at. And then I started drawing because a lot of these chores, I had to maintain a certain amount of anonymity. I had to like change the names of people. So instead of really presenting my work as stories, I started drawing the people. So then it made sure that they couldn't be identified. But then also it was a slow process. It took much longer than clicking a picture and putting it in the thesis. But it also made sure that I spend more time with their stories. So as I was drawing, I also drew people. I also drew, as you can see. So most of the drawings I will show you, it's based on hand-drawn sketches that I later digitized. So when I was even drawing, let's say, the landscape or the houses, it was very easy for people to talk to me, because they could point out things that the house entry is not here, the entry is here. So they felt like I was making the drawing, but they felt equally like that they were helping me make the drawings. And they could say, oh, we have a shop here that shifted here. In the monsoon, let's say the hut is here. Then they move, in the dry season, it moves somewhere else. So it was really easy for them to also get what I was doing when I was drawing. So then drawing became, that's why, a very powerful tool to connect with the people, but also for me to take time and really understand the whole dynamics. And I made sure, because the landscape changes so much, I made sure I did fieldwork in different seasons. So this is the one in Birsingsor, this is the one in the dry season where you see that the sand comes up, and the same thing in the monsoon season where you actually have to access the house through the boat. But then here you already see that they already change. Here you have these, we call kothia, so the rice saplings that they grow, which is also in the monsoon season, which they will shift in another larger field in the post-monsoon season. And of course, then I had to make sure that I'm looking at different scales. So of course, from the previous photos, I could look at the landscape at a larger scale, where I could see how the landscape is changing, but also at the photos that I took with my phone camera, we're also looking at different ways, different activities, different livelihoods, and different practices that the community was doing. So actually, this is how my research was arranged. I had this one chapter which was more a historical chapter. I was looking at it on the scale of the Brahmaputra Valley, but I looked at how the valley was from the pre-colonial. So I had 3 periods in this part, where there was a pre-colonial period when the British came, and then the post-colonial. But I was looking at different elements of how in the pre-colonial, let's say in the Ahom period, we were kind of inhabiting the landscape. And then when the Britishers came, and maps were a very important tool of conquering the landscape, it was more looked as a way of how can we conquer the landscape. And then that has continued in the post-colonial after independence. And then I had 3 cases, as you can see. I had Majuli, which is more well known, and I will focus more today. I had the Kartik Sapori, which was where Mulaikatuni, the forest, is. And then this is the downstream, which is near the India-Bangladesh border. But today I will bring up some of the drawings of Majuli, because I think it's, of all 3, it's the most well known. And yes, so I'll bring up some of the drawings of Majuli, because yes, I think you will recognize certain things. But also I think Majuli also has been studied so much that I also wanted to show how we can look at it from a different angle, and maybe that will give you some inspiration for your own work. Yes, so in this section I will quickly bring up some of the drawings and go through the process of how we can assemble those kind of drawings. So I was focusing on this red rectangle. That was my research frame. So it's part of the southern edge of Majuli. So I started drawing the water. So as always, because I feel like when we are studying these kind of landscape, there are different ways to start it, but I always want to and like to start with water, because I think that is the main formative agent, water and silt, for these kind of landscapes. So rather than saying where the roads are, people usually start with roads and houses. So for me it was very important. So I did a similar exercise. I drew the water. So actually this drawing was made in for the year 2022 for all 12 months. I'm showing you one. This is, I think, October, post-monsoon. Darker blue is dry season, lighter blue, wet season. And then within this frame, I started tracing what is happening. So let's say the blue is the water, a little bit of, in the monsoon season, a little bit of silt. But I tried to see, and there's a lot of data available, but you also have to check what is happening. So I got a lot of GIS data, but I also verified it on when I was on field. So I started looking at, rather than saying vegetation, if you look at the legends, it will say grass, reeds, shrubs, trees. So making a distinction, not putting everything as green, because then you kind of lose a lot of the layers because trees are very different. The way people use trees are very different from ways they use shrubs, because shrubs would be part of people grazing the cattle, but the trees have a different purpose. So I was starting to make distinctions for that. And then I was looking at main crops. I focused on rice, but also there were different varieties of rice. So in the monsoon season, you would have ahu rice, hali and bao. But then in the monsoon season, they had a cycle. So some of them would be harvesting, some would be sowing a different kind of rice. And then within this landscape, I started with one missing family. So if you see, there is a black dot. So it's one missing family. So I wanted to look in the monsoon season, in different season, how these families are moving around, what are the different livelihoods they are engaging in. So if you see in this, so I was tracing how the family is getting married and the structure of the family. And then in this drawing, I tried to place those different members with the different activities they were doing. So let's say you see one with the cows. So one of the guys would take the cows off. They would go to this, we call it kuti. So you have mohar kuti and goru kuti, which is where you have cows and buffaloes. So he would move to another place, stay there with the cows, graze them. There would be people who would be sowing certain kind of rice. There would be women who would be involved in harvesting. And then they would be fishing, because in the monsoon season, they wouldn't venture too much in the middle of the river. So I started seeing what kind of activities they are doing. And in the monsoon, they don't come much to the, this is more Jorhat town in the south. They remain more in Majuli, because also in certain times, the ferry service gets closed. So then I did similar exercise in the post-monsoon season. So now you can see there is a line, which is the route of the ferry. So then they would go, let's say have some additional activities. So they would have, let's say some people would be going to Jorhat to sell the milk, which earlier they would be managing within Majuli. So what happens in this, these kind of exercise, what comes up is, rather than focusing on household unit, which let's say you have a father, mother and a son, their really meetings were on these kind of extended families. So they would, if someone is married also in another family, they would become part of this family, and there was a very, let's say, a division of labor of who does what. So that's why also in different season, like they would be able to sustain their livelihood, because it's not a simple thing of going to office and coming back. It's very much tuned to what is available in the landscape. So similar thing in the dry season, you would see a lot of winter crops, mustards, vegetables and wheat. But from this kind of exercise, which became very apparent, is instead of imposing static conditions on these landscape, they really understood that in different seasons there are different assets. So accordingly, they would leverage the seasonal abundance and then really diversify different kind of livelihood. And that's the way they were able to sustain their livelihood, even when, you know, certain resources went down. Then they would look for other resources in other parts. And then there is this constant moving in and out using the different resources. So here I was looking at more how one family was, let's say, interacting with the landscape. I also wanted to see how different communities interacted with each other and what is the reciprocity and dependence on each other. So I was looking at in the map, you can see the red dots, which are the different hot cross in Majuli, and also in this orange blob kind of thing are the missing villages. So I was trying to see how these two different communities live in this, share this same space. And what very interesting thing came out is most of the time the Hotras have a lot of land that they have got from previous kings, but then they have not much manpower to cultivate it. So they would hire the missing people to cultivate the land. So then they became like a kind of relationship. So here you see a missing village on a bun, and before this is the monsoon season, and behind the bun you have this field which is owned by the Hotra, and then you would have missing people who would become also the Hotra becoming a little bit more open to missing people because of these kind of relationships that they have developed over the years. The bund is also a very interesting element for me, also from the point of architecture. But also, if you see these two sections, one is in the dry season and monsoon, and you can see the bund here. So also how the people use the bund. So during the dry season, they would act as a very public social space, like an extension of their courtyard. But in the wet season, in the monsoon, when the water would come up to the stills, many times the livestock which would usually be placed under the stills, they would be taken on top of the bunds. So for instance, here you can see in the down, so you have these kind of structures that are being made, and then the livestock and the cows would be placed in these structures. There's also these kind of, on either side of the bund, there would be these bamboos that are planted. So you would have the shaded microclimate on top of the bund in this very warm heat. And the image on the top, you could see how the bund is being used as for multi-purpose activities. There is a woman spooling yarn for the loom, they're drying clothes, they're used as drying spices, they're using it to dry firewoods. And also in this drawing, similar kind of activities. So these kind of techniques actually became very important to show what I wanted to show very easily. So I take a picture and I try to put these different kind of activities in white, and then you have these labeling systems. So it's, I think I found a very, I won't say easy way, but a very effective way to translate to what I was saying. So when you are trying to explain fieldwork and these kind of activities, I think these kind of techniques work very well. And it was also like a very gendered space where you would have specific places, specific activities that men would be grazing the cattle and the buffalo, and then there would be women in the picture down who would be engaging in fishing in the field. So there are also very specific places that each gender occupies, but also in terms of activities, very gender-based activities. So in this case, I think this is one of the most important thing I want to highlight. So you would see in all the drawings, I always try and put the local words. Because what happens, and because I did my PhD in Belgium, there is a tendency to simplify words because it's difficult to understand. I would say, let's say for instance, so in one of the words, let's say pitoni. Now pitoni, if I say in English, it's very difficult to explain it, and there is not one word that I can translate it. Let's say I can say swamp. But the moment I say swamp, it takes so much away from what pitoni is. And pitoni is also, let's say it's marsh, it's a marshy land, it has like these ankle deep water. There is certain image and also certain kind of uses to pitoni. And there are different ways. I tried to, like when I was talking about water bodies or swamps, I tried to have different words that are used by the people, because they also, let's say a pukuri is used very differently than a pitoni. But I can say both of them are water bodies. So that's why I think I want to highlight that why it's very important to use the local words, because you risk so much by just translating it into English, and you lose so much of what it means to the local people, what it means in the ways they are used, and also the way they are seasonally used. So in the thesis, I had a whole glossary of local words that I had used throughout the thesis, and also I think this is also a fantastic book, maybe many of you know, but it really talks about these kind of how places and landscape holds so much of wisdom, history, but also in certain cultures like us, they also hold like these moral lessons Like you would say, you know, like in this part of the forest you cannot go because, I don't know, there's some kind of superstition linked to it. But it's also based on certain kind of why in certain areas it becomes cold, or there is a kind of something happens there. So there is the landscape over the years, it holds so much of these wisdom that when you translate it to another language, you complete erase it. So that's why I feel it's also like I keep stressing more on the point that when you do research in these kind of areas, I would really ask you to retain and keep the local words. I would quickly end it. I would bring out some of the insights from, because I talked about lessons. So now I'll quickly bring out lessons in terms of what we can take out from the charts. Because it has to be said that the way I present it could also feel like a bit of romanticism, that I'm trying to say everything is very traditional and everything is working great in the chart, which is not the case. Over time, it has become very clear that the traditional wisdom that they have is not enough to combat climate change. So there has to be like additions in it. It's not that we can just take it and apply it everywhere else. But what becomes very clear, and if it is something that you can take from this presentation, is how can we see these landscapes in a new way? And through visualization I have tried to do it, but also to look at shores not from the imaginaries that we have, that they are these faraway lands, or in some cases like Majuli, or they are like these pristine environment that, okay, but we can never do what they have done. We live in the city, we live in apartments. So I think that's, if you can shift the perspective of seeing these things, I think it's enough. So the first insight is about movement. So all throughout the drawings I was talking about movements. I was never saying in terms of how people live, so movement is very much part of how people inhabit the landscape. But when we are designing our cities, so this is the master plan for the Guwahati city for 2050, we rely on these kind of master plans, because also it's convenient to put specific blocks. You have specific areas that you have yellow for agriculture, red industrial, purple industrial. So you would put specific, and you have these very color-coded scheme. But in reality, the ground doesn't behave like that. So instead of relying on these fixed master plans, which are centered around land use zoning, what you get when you rely is the kind of, let's say, riverfront developments we have. So you would straighten the edges, you would put different activities, then you would pay, people would pay to come and see those activities. But then all of the activities that were going on is kind of removed, and then they have to find another place to do it. So the idea was that future development frameworks could instead be informed by these kind of movement maps. So this is a map that I was developing. So it traces, so the dash are the water and the dots are the silt. But it shows the gradual transition from water to silt. So these kind of maps, so I was developing it for, this is for, I think, October. But then there were different maps for different months of the year. So this gives you an idea of how it is changing, instead of those different colored blocks that is static for till 2050. Next, I was looking at how the kind of the morphologies that I talked about, let it be the missing sanghor, or here you see the kuti, which they use for grazing buffaloes and cows. So these really, they are made in a way which really uses, like, the resource utilization is in the center of it, because there is limited resources. So that's not to say that we have to live in a sanghor, but to say that how they are building it. So let's say in the kuti, so I tried to highlight the plants that they have planted along. So to make sure that the herder who stays there alone, apart from his family, he has everything he needs. So he would have curry leaves, he would have bottle gourd, he would have some vegetables, he would use cow dung to grow the plants. You would have some kind of, we say, hack, so that he doesn't have to go far. And he's, of course, he would have get some fish when the family comes, but they are very occasional. But they are constructed in a way that it's really utilizes the resources that he has around him. So I think in this context, there is really a very urgent opportunity that we recover these kind of innovative typologies when we are talking about development even in the cities. And I feel recognizing is these kind of typology, especially for architecture, is like like the first step towards climate adaptation. The next one was in terms of agriculture. So in the chore, they, as I said, seasonally they would have different crops. They also practice what is called flood recession agriculture, where they would use the level of water in different seasons. So in this map, I tried to trace in different months, according to the level of water, what kind of crops they are growing. So they would, it's like a rotation of crops in the same land, but as the flood water comes up, it leaves moisture and nutrients, so then they would plant a different kind of plants. So I think these kind of methods, if we can transfer it, is also kind of helping in enhancing food security in other parts of the world. Yeah, and this one I was talking about how we need to, for climate adaptation, we have a lot of projects happening at a bigger scale where we are, let's say, this is a map, this is a series of maps if you want to have a look. It's called the Atlas for the End of the World. So it really talks about in terms of climate change at a larger scale. So these map talks about biological hotspots, but there is also knowledge from the bottom up where you have a lot knowledge of the communities, and somehow these two are dealt very differently and they have not found a way to combine them together. So you would have, because you would consider indigenous knowledge as something of the past, but then they could really become critical building blocks for climate adaptation. And I think this is the last one where I'm talking about the strong relation of cosmology and rituals to the subsistent economy. So here I was looking, as I mentioned, I was looking at how the communities what is their relationship to nature, how they view nature. So in this sense, I was also looking at a lot of paintings and manuscripts. So here you have the Great Deluge, where I was looking at how in Assamese culture, paintings depict nature. So here you could see the earth sinking, and then you have the clouds, and there is a torrential rainfall happening. Even the ways that they are painting shows what kind of adherence they have to nature, the colors they use, how much boldness, what are the colors of the cloud, how are they drawing water. So when I was looking at the community, I was also trying to see that there was like a strong intertwining of spirituality with ecological stewardship. So people took responsibility for the nature because it's like a two-way thing. They take care of nature because they get something out of nature. So in this, if you live in that way, it's very difficult to abuse nature because you need it for your own sustenance. The community needs the forest for medicinal activity, medicinal plants, or plants for different rituals. So there is already a kind of kinship with nature where it's part of your world and not something separate that you go on a walk on, which I feel somehow we are losing in our cities, because we have very separate, we go on hikes and trails on nature, but it's not part of our daily life. We don't require it. So I think that kind of thing became very important to me. Maybe I will stop here. I have a few reflections. But I think I will stop here, and I hope you have questions and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Swagata. It was very interesting with the way you presented with so many pictures, because we are very used to seeing a lot of text otherwise on the slide. So this was very different for, I think, all of us. It is open for questions, reflections, suggestions. Yeah, there used to be one question.
Hello, my name is Rohit, and this is a very wonderful presentation. I have seen this kind of presentation with drawings and everything. So it's thank you for the session. I just had few queries. First is whether the people there have factored in the dam and its dam modulating the water flow. So have that been factored in and included in their knowledge of the water? Has it changed anything? How did they predicted before and now they have predicted something else? Second one is that while I was walking in Dhimaji, the people there are suffering from this farm productivity loss due to flood-induced sand deposition. So that is upstream. So if you have been talking to so much of these people who have been growing rice, so if they are also suffering from something similar, if that has changed their productivity as well in Majuli.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, regarding the dam, there are, so in all the three cases, I was looking at the ways these infrastructure projects, whether they be dams or bridges, they were affecting the community. I think that's why it was also quite different in the two communities, because I think when I was doing Majuli, because now it's enclosed by the embankment, so there was already this talk about how the sand is being, like earlier they used to have these silt coming into, but because now we are trying to block off the sand. I don't think I have it here. So we are trying to block off, so there is already at the edge of the embankment the sand would deposit, and sometimes if it breaches, so then the sand would come into the fields, and then this whole area, like they wouldn't be able to grow anything. So there is more, and I think there are a lot of other studies that have already done this, and they have seen how it's actually affecting the agricultural productivity of people in Majuli. But the case was a bit different, and that's why more interesting downstream, because downstream, of course, it's more, where I did in Silsor, it was more remote, so there isn't any dam, but they are building the bridge, which is connecting the north and the south in Meghalaya. There people have been still able to, they don't have embankments, they still construct these smaller scale enclosures, these earthen dams, and they use it, but there hasn't been any, so in terms of infrastructure projects, I would say downstream it's more in terms of the bridge, and the impact of that is not very sure because it's still in construction, but now a lot of the trade is happening on the river through boats that are owned by the community, the Charwas. But now after the bridge, they are quite afraid that maybe they will have this all-weather connectivity and they wouldn't have a role in trade, and they would be using that. Yeah, and the next one was about the agriculture.
Farm productivity.
The farm productivity. Yes, I think this was constant in all of the three cases, that the way they were cultivating, they have not been able to predict the weather in recent years. And it's a direct link to climate change, how the monsoons have been, like for instance, they would grow certain plants, let's say in September, like when the monsoon water goes down, they would plant certain kind of crops, let's say. But then in recent years, they would be like these very untimely rains in October, and then they would not be able to, the whole crop would be damaged. So there has been, and in all the three cases, it has been more and more, that they have not been able to, they have been having a lot of loss of agriculture, and they don't know, and that's why a lot of people are moving out of agriculture, because they have not been able to sustain as a livelihood. It's not enough, so they go to a lot of manual labor and go in construction industry. And that's why I think I was saying, like, their knowledge alone is not enough, because we already see the impact of climate change, and mostly in our agriculture, like it's self-evident now that how they have been doing it is not enough, and it's, you cannot rely on the wisdom they have. There has to be other interventions in terms of how they react to climate change.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Like, I was particularly interested in your methods, because I particularly for my research I'm drawing from Nigel Thrift's non-representational methods, which speaks of performance, creativity, and art in landscape inquiries, and I see that you have merged a lot of art. So I just wanted to know that, like, did you actually draw from the idea of non-representational theory when you decided to study the performance, the movement of these people within these landscapes, and what are your reflections? What could be the disadvantages or the limitations of non-representational methods, because we have not developed them completely yet. That is one. And the second thing is that when you said that in Lower Assam you have studied the immigrant Muslim populations, right? So they do not have an historic knowledge related to the landscape, because of course they're immigrants. But then they come from Bangladesh, which itself faces a lot of flooding. So did you see any instances where they have used the knowledge they have had in Bangladesh to apply them in case of floods in Assam?
Yes. About the reflection, I actually had slides which I didn't use, so I'm very glad you asked. Yes. I think also it's very important in terms of the methods, because the idea of using this, it's very discipline specific. Where I come from, we use like these kind of illustrations a lot. But the idea, I borrowed a lot from social sciences, let's say, when I was doing fieldwork. But the only thing was, I think, when I was representing them, when I was disseminating the information, I did it through graphics. So it was much easier for people to catch on, and also it's in my discipline we do a lot of maps and things. But I think the idea of using different methods was because it let me let's say it let me look at it from different angles. So if I look at chores and I just go by the narrative, I would have a very preconceived notion. But because I was looking at everyday lives of people, let's say the missing population, but also the Bengali Muslim population, because I was going through it from that angle, like things became a bit more, I could look at it from different angles, but not the only narrative. Before I started doing the research, I also had a very single narrative about the chores and its people. But because I was looking at, let's say, also paintings, so I could identify something that was made in the hot draw to what these people were saying. So for instance, like just an example, so when I was doing in downstream store, so the chores are very much more dynamic than Majuli. So they would a chore would come up, and then in the next season it will go down. So let's say a person puts rice on it or constructs a house. Now he claims ownership of that area, right? So in the next season, next monsoon, that chore goes down, and then another chore comes up. So for him it would be very normal to claim ownership of the other chore. And even let's say how the paperwork work is, he keeps giving, they call it khajna, so it's like a rent thing. So he keeps giving this very nominal rent even when the chore disappears, because eventually when they do the survey, he could claim the other chore saying that I have been paying khajna for this thing. And it's related to his belief, because like for him it wasn't something that, oh, it's illegal for me to claim that, because in his belief, and he said it very simply, that for me, I believe that the water takes and the water gives. So when the water took away his land, when another one came up, he believes that the river gave him that land. So it's linked to his cosmology of how he views nature, that nature is harsh, but nature also gives. So that's a completely different way of thinking about land and ownership and property than we have, that you have this very piece of land that you stamp and it's paper. And I feel like somehow that works very much in these kind of landscape, because in these kind of landscape you cannot allot a property of land, because otherwise the law, like there is, what can you do? Like the land, you cannot control it. So it's a very like in-between subversive way of trying to inhabit a shifting land without like these legal things. What was your second one?
The Muslims, Bangladeshi Muslims.
Yes, yeah, they do a lot of, actually if you see, because when I was doing my PhD, there was also a person from Bangladesh in the same university, and she was working with public spaces. So we discussed a lot, and it was very similar that the kind of, let's say, houses they construct. Because the missing, they construct houses on stilts, but here you have like this mound, and then there would be like a drain around it where water will go in, and there is a lot more to do with vegetation than stilts. And there were very similar construction in the other side with Bangladesh. So even though the families that I studied, they have been here for, let's say, 4 generations now. So they had migrated like a long time ago, 1910 or something. Even then, I could see a lot of similarities on the chores in Bangladesh, which is just across, you can walk. So there you could see the construction methods are very much similar to the kind of things they use. Also the kind of vegetables they grow, the way they make certain kind of medicinal things. So even though I think the family itself didn't come, maybe it's the way they adapted to the similar kind of floods, that they had very similar practices and architectural things.
Anything? Any more question? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very nice presentation. It's something that's new we have just seen. I just want to ask what Shripad has just asked. Do you see any kind of sense of attachment for the people of the Bangladeshi Muslims? Because they have migrated today. And another thing is that you have shown about the movement of people. Do you consider how the mobility of the people is changing and how they have been adapting?
Yeah, I think like firstly with the people, like they see like as like themselves, they see themselves as Assamese, because I think it's also they have been here for 4 generations. They have not seen Bangladesh. They have the papers and everything, which is, you can also make the papers, but I think in terms of like their family history has been in that area or around that area. So they have, I think, heard that their family came and here, but none of them have been to Bangladesh and none of them are in contact with people with Bangladesh. So I think for them, they think like they have known Assam, and they have known Assam like it's a hard life, but so that for them, that's what also was when I went to the field, that was something that I was curious about, what they think about it themselves. Of course, they understand this background of socio-political background, what is happening, but it was very much clear that even they feel kind of confused of calling themselves Mia Muslims, which I think also they have accepted it, so they are to a certain extent, but then there is also a kind of that this is all the land we know, and it doesn't matter whether it's in like India or Bangladesh, because we have grown up here and we have gone out to study. So there is a lot of people, so for them, let's say education was very important to get out of poverty. So a lot of people would, the person I was in contact, he was an engineer who actually studied with my uncle in Assam Engineering College. So they have a lot of people who are going to school and colleges to make sure that they have other livelihoods. So that's also the reason where I feel a lot of traditional livelihoods in the chores are declining, because, and I think it's the same in Majuli. People are moving out and there is very less traditional livelihood. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask. That the sense of attachment is very important.
Yeah.
We are dealing with the adaptation thing.
Yeah. Because the family structure, that was what was surprising to me, the family structure, because I was working on really making a sketch of who is father, mother, uncle, who is working. So then I found it quite similar to the family structure I was drawing in Majuli, or whether I was drawing with Jadhav Payong and his family. So it was always these different kind of people coming in and out, always like a constant movement. And that was very surprising for me, because if I don't tell you like this family is from this area or this family, the family structures would be quite similar of what you see in rural Assam. So yeah.
Oh, there are 2 questions. Yeah, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Swagata, for your wonderful presentation. My question is in terms of the ecological dynamics of the interaction with the communities. Now you've selected 2 safaris which are distance apart, the upstream and downstream, and they have different communities around it. So I was just curious to understand, does the practices of the communities change anything in terms of their interaction with the ecology? Because I do understand that the biodiversity in both the regions are also more or less different, the grasslands and everything. So did you notice any kind of changes in the dynamics and the interaction because of the different practices? And if yes, then how would one actually depict them graphically to understand these dynamics? I was just curious to answer that.
Okay, thank you for the question. So actually, yes, of course there is differences, because the landscape is so different, and that's why also the main difference I would say is different livelihood activities. So let's say when I was showing you Majuli, they would have these, we call mohor kuti, so there would be like pastoral activities which was absent here, because downstream you would have these vast sand, so the sand would come up, but there wouldn't be like that kind of grass that would sustain cattle. But when you went to Majuli or near Kartik Sapori, you have the forest that Jadhav Payong planted. So there you would have more of those activities. They really have, I think, in both the villages, they were herding communities, which was completely absent below. Below it was mostly agriculture. I think in Majuli, like people were also moving. I think there is also the background that upstream, people were more free to engage with other activities because they are still considered Indian. Like, because down you would have people who are engaging in agriculture, and the people where in certain households that agriculture was suffering, they would move out of the chore and then they would be like construction labor, or they would like rickshaw pullers. So that was the main, like I think there they had some limitation in terms of what kind of job access they had. And then upstream, because in upstream you also have welfare schemes from the state that the missing people can, as the ST community. So if you see, that's why like this difference was very important for me, because as the scheduled tribe, they had access to certain welfare schemes of the government that the downstream population were not. So then many times, that's why they would have, even if you see in the map, they could do a lot of different activities, which was, I actually don't have this map for downstream now, but they could engage in more diverse activities than the downstream. So downstream I could see was mostly like agriculture, or then you go to construction. Or the other option which they are opting for is education, and then they move out, and you know, you have people working in Dubai, or that's a different kind of dynamics. What was your second question? I keep forgetting.
How do we represent it, the dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also depends on your discipline how you do it, but also this dynamics. There are, if you talk about mapping, I would suggest, I haven't put the books here because we have a very strong culture of mapping, and there is a difference for, we like to mention where instead of maps, we call it mapping, because map is a static entity, but mapping is a process. So even if this map I'm showing, if you make it with the same kind of information, it would be a completely different map, because you are making a lot of selections. So in the whole process of the mapping, it really, so you think of mapping as a tool, not like an end goal, like how you have master plan. So if I make a master plan, it would be very different than someone else, because I make specific choices with the same information. So in terms of representation, I think a lot of people I feel who come from non-graphical discipline are very scared of drawing, because they feel like we can't draw well, we don't know how to. But it's a simple method of, if I show like something like this, even this map, what I did was, it's not a map, it's a photograph. So I have a very small drone, I took a picture, and I tried to highlight the parts I want. So if you see the image is black and white, I highlighted the green fields. So it's a very simple Photoshop thing, I mean, you can learn it. It's but then immediately your eyes is drawn to the field, because in this slide I'm talking about the fields where the missings are working. Then you have these kind of labelings. You can also put some kind of people here, different kind of, and now you have a lot of graphical tools for it. But it is as easy as this. So you just have to make, when you are talking about graphical language, it's as easy as what do you want the person to show. And that's why throughout the maps I made, I hardly took anything from GIS. That's not a brag, but it's because there were very limited data available for my areas. But also, when you take something from GIS, you have a lot of layers. You don't see what you just take the layers. It's very automatic. And we talk a lot about AI and doing things. There is something about doing things by hand. So when you, even if I had GIS layers, I drew on top of it. So even like sometimes it's as easy as printing it out. So even this map, I would put a tracing, or if you work on tablet, it's as easy as that, you draw it. Even the same thing, if you are drawing it, you get more understanding about which area rice is grown. Which, if you just take the layer, which is very easy, but then you have no idea. You can have 10 maps, I can make 10 maps, but I wouldn't know what to explain. But even if I take, this map took me few days to make, I think weeks, I don't know, but it also constantly changes. But in terms of mapping, I think these are the things where, in my case, it was very important to have like these large scale maps. So if you see this map, so this is the first layer. So this is just the landscape. So this you can get from GIS for other things, but then you also collaborate with your fieldwork. And then on top of it, I put these social practices, which are people doing different kinds of work. So then in itself, the map is not very complicated. But if you look at like these, it seems like, oh, you need a lot of graphical skill to make it. So it can be as easy as making different layers, which is what we work in architecture. So we always work in layers. And then eventually, when you put like these 10 layers, it really gives off something that you want to translate to people. So I think in terms of graphic, I mean, there are different ways. There are a lot of scholars working on mapping. There is something, research project called Mapping Otherwise. So it's, maybe you can look it up. So it's about mapping, which is not a map. There is a lot of, I can even like send some references to map, because I think also it's very important for your discipline and humanities and social science, because there is so much information, and I feel like finding the right way to represent it can really make sure that you don't lose the information, because otherwise it's like you have to write a lot, and then which ones give, like in visual medium you can select or make a choice what you want people to see. So that's why, like, even though I wrote about these things, I made sure I had a map with everything that I wrote, so that people can still read and take their time. But if you don't have the time, you can just look at the map, and there I can really control what I want you to see. So I think in that sense, like accompanying with some kind of, it doesn't have to be a map, like any kind of illustration, it's very easy for people to interpret it. And if you know what you want to show, I think it's also very easy to make it.
Okay. Okay, you have a question.
Thank you, Swagata.
Yes.
I really appreciate an architect coming and
Just one
doing
second.
this.
I don't know. Do you know who is he?
Yes.
Because she has
No,
referred to
no.
your work.
Your work is in a book is in
no,
every bibliography I have.
We were discussing with Dilip Khuna about
Yes.
possibilities of similar work, and I really appreciate. Thank you so much. A small query and a small intervention. Is this whole question of payment of revenue and the shores going up and down, rise and fall of the shores, right? And the payment of revenue, I think it is, cosmology is one part of it. Let's say speculation.
Yeah.
I think it is more to do with a long historical legal
Yeah.
question. Right in the Mughal time, or around the same time in Bengal, especially in Bengal, lower part of Bengal, there was always intense competition, especially amongst the zamindars, right, who will control the ownership
Yes.
of the future shores, right, because they know that shores will come up at any point, right. So I think that it is precisely these geological speculations that they were holding on, and which they kept on negotiating with their power, with their access to the political institutions, and the Mughals more or less given fine-tuning to these patterns of payment, right? You keep on holding on,
Yeah.
like that. But what happened in the 19th century, by 1820s, laws were put in place. One of the most important law was Bengal Alluvial and
Yeah.
Diluvial Act, right? I'm sure you know about it, and which actually played an enormous role. The influence of this law even in the Brahmaputra Valley by the mid-19th century was very clear. Missing rich landowners, they would be fighting amongst themselves, especially in and around Majuli area, right? So let's say around 170 years earlier, right? To have a control over who is going to control these chores in future. Whenever something is going to burn, is primarily through my present existence, my present practices, and also my power, right? All actually played a very big role, apart from what you say, probably the questions of cosmology. But I think the law and political practices was equally important, which was further reinforced by the questions of class.
Yes.
I think the power, right? Who is more powerful? Poor obviously will get defeated. The second is my question. I was just thinking about the cadastral maps. Some cadastral maps were made about the chores post 1967. Before that, there was no cadastral map of the chores. Do you think you can do some experiment with the cadastral maps, how the officials, especially the land revenue officials, think about the fixity of the chores, properties, houses, and everything, right? And then communities, will there be some difference? I have no clues about that, if you can think of this possibility.
Yes, that's very interesting, because also in my manuscript, so I have a chapter on where I go through the history. So as you said there, I also tackle with the different laws and policies that came about it. But there I also bring up some of the cadastral maps that were made. But then I didn't carry it to the present. So in my research, because it was very much about mapping, so I had the cases which dealt with, let's say, present scenario from fieldwork. But I did have a chapter. But I think, as you said, it would be very interesting to like start off with the cadastral maps from those times and then do these kind of exercises on what we know from history about the people studying.
You know, cadastral maps are also the idea of fixity, right?
Yes.
Everything is fixed, right? But chores and the whole idea, the water and the land, they keep on moving, right? Depending on the, I really appreciate the reference to the Hindu name, the typical names, right?
Yeah.
U, Mark, like
Yeah.
that. It changes accordingly. If we can think of those maps, it might be probably a great additions to your the present interventions. Right?
Yeah.
That might be it. Because we have not done really good studies of this catastrophe.
Yeah, true. Yeah, that's actually, I'm thinking it would be a very interesting project.
Right. And thank you so much for your.
Yeah, thank you for your comments.
Swagata, there are more questions,
Yes.
but I will not take any
No
more
problem.
question. But you can meet them
Yes.
outside, and they want to. Some of the PhD scholars would like to talk to you. But let me first thank you on behalf of the department for this very nice presentation. I have been a part of a doctoral committee, and I have seen her presentation several times. But when I sit as a doctoral committee member, always wait, we are always thinking what is missing. So we are also always in a tense situation, But today it was very nice to see how you finally, evolved your thesis. And one last thing I want to say, she did an excellent defense. Because I was there when she was defending, I was invited. Such a nice defense. And what I liked is so many people were hearing about Majuli, and that she did not change none of the native way of calling the landscape. So it was really nice. And so thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.